my next question for Jason, my favorite treasurer here, is how do you facilitate the process as treasurer of creating a budget each year?
Well, you should get as many previous years' final statements from the PTA or PTO. And then I just average
So
them.
you know what you've spent.
Yeah, so you know what you spent, you know what you brought in. And I usually just average them all together, and that's where you start. So depending, fundraising is not going to increase each year. It's just statistically impossible for any type of organization to keep raising more money. So you have up years, down years, middle years. So the best thing to do is probably get copies of the last couple years, which you should anyway, average out all the incomes and expenses, and just start with that as your base budget. Based on the intricacies of putting a budget, one-time things that might be special that year, you'll be able to adjust it up and down. But yeah, unfortunately, the president's going to ask the treasurer for a starting budget, and that's probably the way to do it. You don't create the budget, but you can give them numbers to start with, based on the last 3 years.
Okay, great. And I know, well, how do you feel about just going off of last year's, whatever last year's budget was, and then taking different things into account, like, oh, it's an off fundraising year, we think we can do better. Is that something that
Well, if you
another
don't
way to
have
do it?
access to anything, that's the way to do it. But the mistakes people make there is they'll just take those and up everything. Well, if we spent $1,000 last year in teacher appreciation, we'll make it $1,200 this year just for cost of living, and they'll just make the income go up as well. So if you only have access to 1 year, you have to look at the number and determine, was it a good year for this or a down year? Did we have extra things we had to spend on that we didn't account for? Did our roller skating nights not bring in what we hoped it would bring in, rather than just, mimic last year's altogether?
Okay, and then what advice would you have, or do you have, for a brand new PTO who doesn't have any information? Would you advise that they just go out and get quotes on, or like ballpark estimates on what they think they're going to spend and go from there?
Yep, even when you do personal finance, it always starts on how much you think you're going to spend. So they should say, if we do a fundraising event every quarter, like roller skating or going out and getting percent back on favorite restaurants, they should think through how they want to raise money, and then they need to think through how much they think they're going to expend. And once you put your budget together, then you can see, okay, how many of these nights. And if you go to these places and talk to them, they'll tell you how many checks they usually cut to schools for roller skating nights or special nights out at dinner or ice cream places. They'll give you estimates, and you can kind of put it together from scratch. It's not easy, but that's the way to start.
Well, if I think it takes more work, but then it's only a one-time thing, because then you can make adjustments.
Yeah.
Right?
The other way to do it is to kick off and have a huge fundraising event, and however much money you make, that becomes your budget for the year.
To beat it up.
And start with that and understand what you go through that year and try to improve it the next year.
Yeah, that's great advice, if I don't say so myself.